Hi, I'm Susanna Magenheimer, also known as Random Artist 222 on Instagram. Today I'm doing a series of 3 videos for That's Crafty. Laura, the wonderful owner of That's Crafty, saw my series of coin art posts and asked if I would create a few projects for her. I'm super excited to be doing this as a friend of That's Crafty. That's Crafty is a UK company, and my experiences have always been very good with her service, the products, and the shipping. She carries her own line of stamps, stencils, and different paints and pastes. She also carries her own substrates. And as you can see, this is what I first fell in love with That's Crafty, were her dinky stencils, which are for ATC artwork for small artscapes. They're an excellent tool. And as you can see, I've collected quite a bit of them. So let's review the products I'll be using in my series of videos for That's Crafty. The first is set 4 that you're seeing here. They're acrylic stamps, and they're designed beautifully to fit inside the 2.5-inch ATC coin substrates. They stamp beautifully, comparable to rubber stamps, which I'm more used to working with. Gorgeous designs, as you can see here. There's also the wonderful Textures Collection Stamp Set 4. I'm really in love with this numbers stamp. There's also Crackle Riveted Tin for a great grungy look, Punchinella, Chipboard, Cardboard. And there's also another set she sent me, Set 5, which is really grungy, which is what I love to do. But I'm not using it in this series, but I thought I'd show it to you. There's barbed wire. There's a really cool diatom looking stamp set there. Skulls, the wood, the maze, and the other skull. Really cool to work with. She also carries a series of matte paints. They're multi-surface, and they have very good coverage, and you can use them for a great effect. She also carries her own substrates and chipboards. In this case, she carries, and they're very sturdy. You can see they're not bending. It would take a lot of heat or water media to really make those buckle. I like the fact that some of them have white coating on it, so I didn't need to gesso it. But they also come in a lighter gray scale version, and also the traditional craft chipboard version. So in this video, I'm going to be creating what I haven't seen really in my circles, but I call it my ATC coin mini journal. You can see you can put a lot of pages in here. And I also added some fibers to just liven the piece up a bit with charms, etc. And I used her roses stencil because I felt it gave an elegant cover to the journal, and it fit very nicely, as you can see, just right inside the actual border stamp that I put around it. If you can see really close up, it's from set 4. It's the little bubbly one, and each of those bubbles has little lines inside of them. And I was really impressed to see that the stamp and the embossing caught all that detail. And again, here are the fibers that I just attached to jazz up the journal. I'm also going to be showing you how you can use her texture paste for a different effect. You can use it over a stencil and create a very deeper dimension like you see on the journal cover, or you can do what's called a ghosting effect, or I call it a ghosting effect, where I will be showing you how I wipe it back so that it pulls towards the edges of the stencil and allows you to create these effects. The way I fade out the texture paste allows me to create a translucency, which I'll be showing later on. Such a cool effect. So let's begin. So this is the ATC Coin Journal project, one of 3 projects I'm doing for That's Crafty. So check out the other videos in the links at the end of this video. So you can see this is going to have a lot of pages and a lot of goodness. I'm going to be using That's Crafty set 4. Specifically the bubble, what I'm calling the bubble stamp. It has lots of little lines within the bubbles, very detailed. I'm also going to be using the roses stencil because it fits in the ATC substrate very well, as well as flat matte spray in walnut. I'll also be using her texture paste. It's good quality, very thick. I like how there's very little seepage. And I'm also going to be using her white substrate coin. I like this because I don't need to gesso it, but I'll be applying a layer of paint on that in a few minutes. So let's begin with painting it. Laura sent me 2 wonderful colors, but I decided for this project I was just going to use a very neutral matte paint so that when I apply the rose, it would pop a little bit better. Plus, I'm trying to create a vintage effect. Using the natural color of the embossing paste with the walnut stain sprayed on top of that, and also with the gold that I'll be using as the border stamp to create that vintage effect. So I didn't want to bore you with watching me paint a coin, but this is now dried. And I'm reaching for the texture paste as the next step in creating the coin, but I realized that is not the next step. The next step is actually embossing the gold border stamp. But as you can see with any kind of texture paste, stirring it is a good idea. And you can see how thick this is. I love that. So I'm going to demonstrate an art hack that I figured out for stenciling on small raised chipboard pieces like this. The coin is about 2 to 3 millimeters thick, so it's pretty substantial for a chipboard. Laura sells the substrates within these laser cut panels, so you can use them as a way to frame the circles. But so what I'm showing here is, and let me get that out of the way before I ruin it, is that if you put a stencil over a small piece of chipboard, it will not lie flat against your table. So it will droop over the chipboard. And that's not what you want because it will allow for the stencil not to be crisp when you apply the paste. So I'm pulling out my handy dandy sharp pointed Q-tip in case I do get any seepage. But what I'm doing is replacing the coins back into the framework. And now when I bring the stencil over, it lies flat. And that's the goal when you're working with stencils, is to get that flat surface. So I'm going to close this for a minute because I did realize, as I said earlier, that I should be embossing at this point. So in order to start embossing, I'm going to use the clear acrylic stamp. I'm inking it with embossing ink. And I want to make sure I get good coverage on that. And make sure after you're done using the stamp and inking it up, did you clean that stamp right away? Because it's a clear acrylic stamp, I'm able to center it beautifully because she has a very flush to the 2.5-inch diameter circle. I'm bringing it closer to me so that I can see. And because I have the light coming in from my window in front of me, I can actually see as I'm pressing down the impression happening. And I'm showing you right here, I can see it almost looks like a little suction action. I'm also pressing along it just to reaffirm that the impression takes place. Okay, so I'm going to wash that right away because if that embossing ink is very sticky, and you don't want that drying on your stamp, it'll ruin it. So just be cautious. I'm going to be using an ultra-fine embossing powder because this is such a delicate stamp. I don't want anything chunkier than ultra-fine. And you can tell when you're using a stamp that's got tons of detail, and in this case those little bubbles have multiple lines that create the little circle impressions. The ultra-fine powder is your best way to get that detailed effect. And again, I'm looking against the light that's coming in from my window, to make sure that that impression took place all around the circle. Because at that point, you still have time to fix it. If you see that it doesn't, you could wipe that embossing ink back and then try again. But really, if you're taking it back off the piece, use a paper towel and get that all off, all the stick off. And now I'm just putting in the ultrafine embossing powder. And I'm using the what I call tap and blow technique. So I'm tapping off the excess as I go along, and occasionally I bring it up to my face and blow and huff or blow, whatever you want to call it, onto it to make sure any stray embossing powder is not going to be a part of the heating up or the melting of the embossing powder. And before anything disastrous happens, always make sure to put your lids back on. I can't tell you the number of times that I forget, and I have embossing powder everywhere. So try to avoid that tragedy. I'm going to be heat setting this off the camera. One, because the camera is right in front of me, and it's hard to hold the gun out in front of me and also watch the powders melt. So this is my heat gun. So it's a Marvy heat gun, embossing gun. It's a pretty powerful gun, so sometimes I start heating from underneath when I'm using chunkier embossing powder, but in this case, this is a light powder. It should heat up really quick. I usually count till 10 to make sure that that gun is hot before I start bringing it to the material. And as you can see, I've heated it up, and I'm showing you the detail that I was able to get, which is actually really fantastic in person. If you didn't get to see all that line detail, a photo will be coming up shortly to show you that. So now I'm going to apply the stencil and the modeling paste. There will be some overlap of the rose onto the border that I just embossed on, but it's very little, and it still adds to that effect that this border is shooting out from under the rose, which I kind of liked. So you can see through this stencil to the bottom of that board, so I'm just making sure that I have an even placement of that rose where I want it. And also that tape you see underneath my hand is there to protect the texture paste from going beyond the rose onto the next stencil, or onto the next rose, I mean. So now I'm just going to take some of the texture paste. I have my pointy Q-tip there handy in case there's any seepage that I want to clean up right away. I'm wiping off the back of that spatula. You want to go in one direction, and what I like to do is go from slightly off the stencil before I go into the image, just so that I'm not bringing a huge glob of paste into the stencil and then trying to fade that out. So right now I'm just trying to get a nice even layer of texture paste on there. And ta-da! It worked! Because it was laying flat, I didn't have any seepage on that, and I can now proceed on to the next step, which is I'm going to introduce to you ghosting with texture paste. So don't waste what you have on your stencil. Wipe it back. I try to go in one direction to get all that paste to fade, in this case to the right. So this way it's going to be pooling up. And I was just showing there that light from the window I'm able to see that texture paste and see how it's applying onto. And I just need a little bit extra in certain spots so that I make sure that it's pooling up against the side of those edges. And that helps get me that ghosting effect. So one thing you always want to do when you're done working with the modeling paste and the stencil is wash it right away. Don't delay, because what happens is, even though it looks like it's all cleaned off, in the edges that I'm pointing to here, these little tiny point edges, it collects and it will harden like cement. And when you go back to use it for another purpose, you're not going to get as crisp an image. So wash it thoroughly. So now, before I move on to applying the spray to the ghosting piece that I did, there are two philosophies on drying. One is to let it go natural, and the other is heat setting. I personally like to let my stuff dry naturally. It allows the rows to be more uniform, which if I heat setted it, there would have been chances of bubbles. And also it gives me more think time. So now I'm going to apply the matte spray walnut onto this ghosted piece so you can see the effect that's going to happen as I'm holding up the paper towel. This is not the way to spray something on your desk. Use a box with a big lid on the back. Otherwise you'll get spray everywhere, but for the purposes of the video, this is what I'm doing. So as you can see, the outline's showing. I'm patting it dry. Now that paste is only a few minutes old, so it's already started to dry because it's very thin, but it's allowing me to do this. So don't be afraid. You obviously don't want to mush it down, but you can pat it down pretty good. And then you can see that ghosting translucency effect happening with the interaction of that really sheer paste and the spray. So this modeling paste is still wet. It's just starting probably to form the skin. I'm taking it out of the panel very carefully, because what I'm going to do next is obviously put the spray, the walnut spray on it. But I'm showing here how the effect will turn out. I don't tint my texture paste. I like the natural effect. This is a slightly beige paste, so I like the fact that I felt the spray would absorb into that color and create something nice. Most pastes have a light powdery mixative in it that creates a more pastel finish when you integrate it with some color. So I like to just let my color happen naturally the way I spray it onto the paste. And different pastes out there will give you different effects, so it's just a matter of trying different ones and choosing what you like to work with. So before I leave this to dry overnight, I am taking off all the excess spray around the rows that I don't need and don't want. Because of the paint I used and because of the embossing, it's actually creating a natural resist. So I'm able to pick up that color and remove it and get the original color back. This is not something I could do if I had waited. So you want to be really careful, because obviously your modeling paste is still wet, that you don't want to go and drag onto the paste and destroy the thing you just made. And you can also see with the spray that because of the way this is starting to dry, some of the larger areas of the rose petals are pooling because there's a little concaveness, and that's cool. That actually turned out very cool when this ends up being dried, and you'll see that very shortly. But until I feel that nothing else is going to keep seeping out, because depending on how level the surface is you're working, that seepage can happen for a couple of minutes. So you just want to eyeball it. And if you have a really tight area, again, what I use is that pointy Q-tip on the top to get into the areas where I feel like there's too much excess spray. So this is me fine-tuning. After a few minutes, I came back to it, just fine-tuning any seepage areas. And again, because it's relatively still wet, I'm able to get in there very tight and remove a lot of the stain that I didn't want and I don't want to end up drying up on the border of this rose. The pointy Q-tip is one of my best friends. It's saved me many, many times. So now I'm going to leave it alone overnight. So now it's been 24 hours and I've come back to it, and this is how it dried naturally. So you can see on the inside of the rose, I have that dimension from the dark walnut drying dark there. And because the paste, like I said, has that natural, depending on what they put in it, a natural ability to lighten color, it's a little bit lighter brown. And I could respray it again and get it even darker, but this is a little bit of a shortcut I like using. It's a Pitt Big Brush Faber-Castell pen. When you're working with it, I have a wet paper towel, slightly damp, not soaking, because you have a few, basically a minute of play with it where you can go ahead and blend it out and it'll react to that. And because, like I said, this dried really cool where I had some little concave areas where you can see naturally there, I was able to highlight those areas a little bit more, but leaving the natural walnut stain that was on the more raised areas. So I'm just going to be going around, and this is again based on your likes or dislikes. If you want it darker, do more. If you want it the way it was, leave it alone. So now I finished applying the marker all over the rose the way I wanted it. And now I'm going to add the golden highlights, and any gold paint will work on this. All you have to do is find the gold paint you like. So that way we can do what's called a dry brushing technique, but in this case we're going to use our finger. And the whole point of dry brushing, dry fingering, whatever you want to call it, is that you want all that paint that you pick up on your finger to basically come off, except for the very last layer, almost the last layer before nothing will come off your finger. So then you want to just lightly glance over the top of the now hardened surface. Super light, super light. And I have the paper towel there too, in case I go too heavy for some reason. I can pull some of the color back off before it sets up. But you just want, and see, I did it right there. You just want a very light, like I said, a super light touch to this. So it integrates with the piece nicely. I like catching the edges of the rose versus the centers, because I just spend all that time putting the marker to highlight some of that dark recessed area. So you just want to catch the tops, the edges. So at this point, we're basically done with the project. It's now a matter of putting in the holes, creating the fibers, and completing the project. You can see there are 2 holes that I use, and I prefer the easy method of a drill, like a Dremel or something, 1/8 inch bit. But you can also use an owl, and you need to be really careful because, as you can see, it's super sharp. It's a spear, and you do not want to have that going through your hand, so please use ultimate caution. But basically, I tried it on her chipboard, and it does go through. Use a twisting method, and it'll start to drill into the chipboard. And basically what you're trying to do is have it go all the way through. And then from there, you'd kind of just build out so that you can make the hole bigger. And that's why I prefer the drill. If you're handy, do that yourself or have your husband help you out, like my husband helped me. I also, to create the pages, had this 2.5 inch EK Success punch, and I just punched out a bunch of papers that I wanted. And it could be watercolor, it could be whatever you want to have in your journal. So that's totally up to you. And then in the end, I just added some fibers, and yeah, I'm not a fiber expert, but I added some jewels to it to secure it so it stays tight. And that's basically it. I hope I inspired you. And please remember to subscribe and hit the like buttons. And also, there's a link below to the next That's Crafty video I created using another coin project. Thank you.